Hello, I'm Anthony Kopczynski,
I'm Charlie Kaler. I'm Will Maher.
and this is our Milwaukee Oral History project for Marquette University High School. And today we'll be interviewing Mr. John Gurda today, and our topic will be about the Vietnam War. Okay, our VR man today is Jeffrey Jedalevich. Okay, so let's get right into it. December 7th, 2017. Mr. Gurda, what was family life like for you growing up?
I had 3 siblings, a mother and a father. So there were 6 of us all together. Family life in terms of where we live, what we did, what's socioeconomic background, what?
Just pretty much everything. What you did as a kid for fun, your family activities, any vacations, or what you like to do.
Play baseball.
Yeah.
That's pretty much our recreation. I was raised in the south side around Jackson Park, and then when I was 8 we moved out to Hales Corners, southwest suburbs, where a lot of Southsider, especially Polish and German families were moving. Went to Catholic grade school, Blessed Sacrament, then St. Mary's in Hales Corners. And when I was sort of newly out there, it was sort of the leading edge of suburbia back on the southwest side. And a lot of the things we did was the construction sites. We'd have dirt fights, the big clods of clay we'd throw at each other, from house to house. And that was 1955 was when we moved out there. And because there were still a lot of vacant lots, we played a lot of baseball. I could be wrong, but my memory is like every day of summer vacation we'd play baseball, either on something more organized, Little League, Pony League, or more often in sand lots or vacant lots. And these things were worn. The dirt and the grass were worn. It was base paths for all of us. So that was, in some ways, a pretty typical and rather idyllic America 50s childhood. There were shadows, Cold War. The threat of the bomb. Was something that we were aware of, but it was materially comfortable and fairly anxiety-free. My father was a self-employed one-man sales engineering company. My mom, like a lot of moms back in those days, didn't work outside the home. She had kind of a real small interior decorating business. And the money she made from interior decorating, that went to tuition at Market High, which then was $425 a year. So, it's knowing smiles. So it was, economically, we were comfortable. Not rich, but certainly comfortable. My dad was self-employed, and he was, I guess, workaholic wouldn't be too far from the truth. He felt he could never stray very far from the house because that was where the calls were coming in. The work phone and the house phone were pretty much the same. So when we did vacations, we would do New York City in 4 days, or Washington, D.C. in a long weekend. We just haul out there and see everything we could and then come back home. So we didn't want to be away from that home that long, but we all of us had fond memories, those trips.
Do you remember any specific events concerning the Red Scare? Any drills that were?
We weren't doing the duck and cover stuff, hide under your desk, those sorts of things. It was more the news. I can recall the Cuban Missile Crisis, 61. I can recall 59 when Batista fell, and Castro began to come in, and there was a lot of anxiety about what that might mean. Russia was putting nuclear warheads, or on the verge of putting nuclear warheads, 90 miles off the shores of America. So there was kind of that specter has been lifted to some degree. Now North Korea is, another candidate for the same sort of thing. But these two superpowers, just the prospect of this mutual annihilation, was something that I think gave my generation perhaps a greater sense of impermanence, than our parents or grandparents might have felt. The fact that you could blow up the earth, that was a power, that had not existed on Earth before.
Yeah. On a lighter note, what was, what was your favorite memory from growing up?
Well, I think the most memorable memory, I guess, would be
What were the positions you played for baseball, or when you played?
I was a pitcher, and I had a strong arm, but I was very inaccurate, so people were afraid of me. So I wouldn't get many guys out, but I'd scare them. And I didn't have the reflexes to play infield, so I spent more time in the outfield. I like to run, like to race around out there. And Little League, I was a catcher. I still have a crooked index finger because caught a ball with my hand instead of my glove. So.
Were you a fan of the Milwaukee Braves?
That's one of the certainly highlights of anybody who grew up in Milwaukee during those years. So I was born in '47. I was 6 years old, 53 when they came to Milwaukee. I don't remember that, but I have very, very clear memories of the World Series of '57. And at St. Mary's in the Hills Corners, to call it hysteria would not be an exaggeration. We actually were let out of class. They suspended class during day games, and we all went down to the cafeteria and watched. The nuns, the biggest TV they could find was probably 24 inches. And they put that up on a chair, and we all kind of clustered around that TV. So lived and died, with the Braves, and they won. In '57. It took 7 games. Lou Burdett pitched 3 complete games. Just incredible. And Lou Burdett was the star of that series. His number was 33. My number in Little League was 33. So that was, I always felt a real kind of a magical connection. So yeah, that was a real high point. They lost in '58, but '57 was just a very high watermark for Milwaukee.
What were some aspirations as a kid? What kind of job did you want, and why?
I didn't have any real clear career aspirations in grade school. We were all kind of hustled to enter the priesthood. There was an order called the Sacred Heart Fathers who were in Hales Corners, still there, Sacred Heart Seminary. And they were sort of supply priests for the church, St. Mary's. And I lived a block away, so I was an altar boy. I was on call 7 a.m., the 7 o'clock masses. So I said a lot of masses. So we were in contact with the priests, and the Sacred Heart Fathers were especially aggressive, about they bring you out to their monastery just on the southwest side of, just a little bit south of Hales Corners, and eat skate, have hot chocolate, and then watch a movie about their minor seminary in Donaldston, Indiana. I can still recall that. And there was one kid in my class who actually enrolled or enlisted, or whatever the term was, went to their novitiate and didn't stay. So that was one aspiration. I guess I don't have any real clear memories of in grade school of wanting to be this or that. By the time late grade school rolled around and high school rolled around, I wanted to be in politics. That was a really strong aspiration. And I was a Goldwater conservative in the early 1960s, and he ran for president in 1964. And even though I was kind of on the right side, there was this charisma that John F. Kennedy had that I remember thinking, why can't we have someone that kind of glamorous on our side? I've since switched sides of the aisle. But what that led to, my junior year, second semester junior year, was a job as a page in Washington. The Southside Congressman was Clement Zablocki, a Democrat who had enough seniority that he could appoint a page, depending on how long you'd been in Congress. That's what gave you, the authority to hire pages or elevator operators or Capitol policemen. It was all patronage. So I was there for 6 months, right after Kennedy's assassination, and the first 6 months of Lyndon Johnson's administration. And talk about a kind of a powerful scratching of the itch. That was a really, really powerful experience. And Potomac fever they talk about, kind of this fascination you have with all things political. I certainly came home with a healthy dose of that. I also came home with a Southern accent because most of the people with long seniority were Democrats who'd been in the South for 30 or 40 years in Congress. So that meant there was a disproportionate number of pages who were from the South. Some of my best friends were from Pascagoula, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, Gainesville, Florida. So I came back, past the butter, and that got pretty quickly kind of sort of scared out of me or pushed out of me by my family. So, who are you?
John F. Kennedy. Did any local Milwaukee politicians grab your attention?
Not in Milwaukee at the time. Part of it was we were suburban, so Hills Corners. And by that time, Henry Meyer was in office. He became mayor in 1960 and stayed until 1988. And I don't recall thinking of him as an especially attractive figure. I don't recall anyone who was charismatic to any degree that approaching what Kennedy had. Warren Knowles was kind of he was governor a little bit before then, and he's kind of a classic, kind of a moderate Republican, a good guy, and I've learned to respect him a lot in later years.
So you went to Marquette University High School.
Right.
What were some reasons for your decision to go there?
It was widely believed, and probably accurately so, that it was the best Catholic high school in Milwaukee. And I took the test, passed it, and there were there were three kids from my grade school class from St. Mary's who went. And it was a bit of a stretch for tuition, even though it was only $425. But that was, my parents valued education, and Catholic education as well. So it was kind of a no-brainer. If you can get in, you'd go. And both of my brothers, I have two younger brothers, who went to Marquette High as well.
What sort of jobs did you have as a teenager?
Almost none. It was pretty much, didn't have work study, as we were comfortably fixed enough. My grandparents had a hardware store on 32nd and Lincoln. I'd work in there occasionally, but that was largely volunteering. Back in the day when you could get money for newspaper and cardboard, that was kind of my spending money. I had a couple of uncles who would dutifully kind of collect and fold and even bundle, their recyclables for me. But in terms of jobs, my first job wasn't until after senior year in high school, when I was at work construction, an actual job during the summer months especially.
Can you explain how your interest in history started?
I didn't care in high school. I did not care whatsoever. I didn't care in college. It was not something that was of interest to me. Looking back, I had two grandfathers who were born in Europe. One, my dad's side Polish, my mom's side Norwegian. They came over here as kids, and both of my parents were very into their heritages. So that kind of rubbed off, but they couldn't talk to each other. They both spoke their languages, but they couldn't talk to each other, obviously, Polish and Norwegian. But we have a license plate that reads Polnar, so we kind of sort of carried that. So there were subliminal things, and my grandparents were old Southsiders, really part of this strong Polish Southside establishment. So I kind of, it was in the air, that was really part of something I was immersed in. But in terms of my active interests, aside from going to the folk fair every year, from the time I was like a baby, and enjoying the food, it was at best passive. And where I began to get into history was after college. I was an English major at Boston College, and I was working we'll probably talk about it in a bit, working for a youth center in the South Side called Journey House, and we were less than a hand-to-mouth operation. We had a staff of, I think, 6 with a budget of $45,000, plus facilities, plus supplies, plus part-time youth staff. So it was really, really bare bones, and we began to prepare what fundraisers today would call a case statement, trying to convince funders why you deserve to be supported. And there was a Vista volunteer named Byron Anderson, and I decided that we would do it. And I was an English major, so I'm kind of interested in writing. But for reasons I still I have no idea why it happened, but I drew the historical research part of it, kind of where the neighborhood came from. And he drew the data part. He was doing all the numbers. And when I began to do that research, the Journey House is probably about 2 miles from my grandparents' hardware store. So it's kind of my neighborhood. And I began to see, kind of these connections between my story, the neighborhood story, the city story, the state story, the American story. So it was all of a sudden, kind of these bells and whistles are going off. And that's 45 years ago. So been doing it ever since.
Were you always planning to do something aside from construction? Like, was that just a job to go from high school to college, or?
That was for money.
Yeah.
You know, didn't want to be a laborer for a career.
Yeah.
But it was, I think my career path by late high school, it was, I think a typical path would have been college, law school, and then doing something in public service and running for office. That was kind of the trajectory I at least envisioned for myself. Didn't happen.
Can you explain why Milwaukee history specifically interested you?
Again, you know, that connection between my story, you know, kind of, you know, today you talk about shop local, buy local, grow local. You know, I've been sort of writing local, researching local, you know, from the start. So, and I've always, it was much more instinct when I started. It was just sort of something that, you know, came without having to think about it, without any kind of reflection at all. But I believe strongly that history is most powerfully assimilated when it's something you can relate to yourself. A phrase sometimes used is all history is local history. There's a guy named William Best. It's in the introduction to the Making of Milwaukee book. He was William Best Hesseltine, was a scholar from UW. And I don't think he meant that literally, but you know, it's kind of on the local level where all these themes, all these larger events really come to roost. You know, where they have an impact. You know, so that's if I'd been born in Poughkeepsie or Sacramento, you know, I might be somebody who's interested in Poughkeepsie or Sacramento history, but you know, here I am.
Attending Boston College, aside from English, what did you study at school?
I began as a political science major. Again, the political side was something I was really interested in. Within about, I sometimes say we were playing intramural football, and I think I was the captain of the team at the time, which didn't mean much. But there was one play where I went up, you know, for a pass against somebody else, and I came down on my head with him on top of me, so I had a concussion. I was out of it, you know, for about 3 days. And what I've always said is that I came out of it and I changed my major to English, so it's political science kind of went away. And it was more a matter of timing. I think what happened was, you know, the 60s were kind of in full swing by then, so I was kind of moving over toward you know, more the countercultural side. And they also had a very strong English department, so it turned out to be a good move. So the first 2 years there was a course called Modern Man, and it was somewhat experimental. You would take just Modern Man, which is all seminars, and then you'd have math and a language. You know, all your other credits were inside Modern Man. And so it was, I think, religion, philosophy, English, and history. There are at least 4 kind of fields there. And it was really interesting for the profs, but it was unsustainable. We were expected at one point, I can recall, to read James Joyce's Ulysses in about 2 weeks. And that's an 800-page book, you know. So it was too much, you know. It was just kind of this. It broke your back, you know, with all the content. If I could go back now, that would be a wonderful course. You know, it'd be kind of a great books course. But back then it was, all I can recall from those 2 years is doing an interesting paper on Phoenician and Sumerian love poetry, which was kind of interesting at the time, but it was, all the rest just kind of, it was like drinking from a fire hose and, you know, getting splashed, so I wasn't swallowing anything. So, and after that it was, you know, electives. I didn't take a single history course in college. I took geology, which I still like a lot. Got a D- in German, got a D- in calculus. And I'd been a really good student at Marquette. I think I finished 3rd in my class. So it was kind of sort of fell off, you know, fell off the table at BC, which is not that unique an experience.
Did you enjoy writing recreationally before becoming a professional author? Oh,
sure, yeah. I mean, words have always interested me. And that goes back to grade school. You know, that's something I wouldn't read poetry, but I would always consider myself a reader and kind of a word guy. And that was, again, instinct. You know, something that was just kind of there. My youngest brother was kind of a gearhead. You know, take a car apart and put it back together, car engine. I had no interest. My second youngest brother, one just below me by 2 years, is an architect, and he always had a real strong design sense. I couldn't draw a straight line, so it was to some degree kind of predetermined.
In the journal section, you wrote about a sort of pilgrimage you took coming back from Boston, going to Miami and to New Orleans. What compelled you to take such a trip?
It's the 60s. So actually the first 2 years, the first year I went up to, let's say in the 66. I hitchhiked from Boston up to Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, around Lake Superior and back. I was on the road for about 3 or 4 weeks. So it was kind of a little bit of a Jack Kerouac thing, kind of on the road. That was kind of in the air. A lot of people were doing that back then. And then the second year it was going down to D.C. and then Miami and up to Pascagoula and New Orleans, then coming home. But it was the romance of the open road. It was kind of sort of this unfettered connection with America, and not very responsible. Not coming home and saying I gotta make money and pay for my books for next semester. It was as you've read, or the impression you may have had is that the 60s were fairly freeform. There was not a great deal of structure. That was expected or desired.
Did you enjoy the music at the time?
Oh Lord, yeah. Oh Lord, yeah. It was. I did not like BC that much. There was a kind of this group of out-of-state scholarship kids, and eight guys from Marquette High got scholarships my year. I got a full ride, to BC. So that made the decision to go there easier. But there was always, at least for me, this disconnect between kind of these earnest Midwesterners and these kind of fast, Long Island, New York, Boston kids. So that was, never felt like I was entirely kind of in the water there. But Boston, is, I'm not sure what the number is now, but back then it had like 250,000 college-age kids, so it was just this kind of pool of young adults, which meant it was a real great market for music, so there's a place we went to a lot. It's called the Club 47, just off Harvard Square in Cambridge, and I would see Richie Havens or Joni Mitchell or David Bromberg in a room about the size of these 2 rooms, in our house, so it was. People would later kind of fill arenas. So it was a great music scene. It was a wonderful music scene. Paul Butterfield Band, kind of a favorite. Cream, I remember seeing Cream. Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, Peter Bruce. Saw them in essentially a garage, kind of a oversized garage. So it was Jefferson Airplane. This is before Woodstock. There'd be these music festivals. There was one on the Boston University campus. It was Pete Seeger, Arlo Guthrie, Jefferson Airplane. I mean, they're really these pretty remarkable when you think about it, music. So yeah, it was a really good music scene. And back then, music was kind of it was a universal language. It was really important to kind of the people on the countercultural side. I've got right behind me, I've got about 4 feet of LPs, that are a lot of the music from that time.
Did the whole feeling of the countercultural music and stuff that was going on at that time, did that have any part in your transition from more on the right-wing side to
sure.
going to the left?
Absolutely. It was kind of it became kind of a what was I thinking, and some of that was drugs too. I didn't drink at all at Marquette High, not in high school. I don't think I had my first beer when I was a freshman. How about you guys?
You're on record.
You're on record. But marijuana, was something that was freely available and widely used. So there was kind of what I've always thought, or what I came to think later on, was that the 60s, which actually went into the 70s, until about 1972 or so, there was and I said that in that column, there was a really strong inward kind of a dimension to it, and that could be just navel gazing, or it could be something, fairly profound, kind of trying to figure out where you are in the world. That was one dimension, and the other was kind of the outward-facing dimension, and that was protest against Vietnam, especially, but also kind of a critique of America as a society, kind of consumerist and materialistic and individualistic and competitive, all these sorts of things. So there was kind of this this kind of scathing analysis of American society, which is why it was called the counterculture. Something quite different. So whether it was the concussion, playing football, or too many hits, from a joint, or just the times, kind of whatever had been, more the Goldwater side kind of fell away, and it became pretty reflexively and very much, again, instinctively, kind of a more part of the counterculture.
Do you connect any life-changing memory with any specific song?
As I said in that column, I was hitchhiking down, 67 is when Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came out, and it's a really strong memory. There was a head shop on Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown, which is the main drag there, and Sgt. Pepper's had just released. It was just out, and the song that was playing was "Fixing a Hole Where the Rain Gets In." Stops my mind from wandering where it will go. And I said, "Whoa!" I mean, it was really a very strong impression. Something that was, even though the music had gotten a lot better, something that really was kind of a departure, from anything that was part of the top 40 radio. Yeah, so that was very strong. And there were a lot of others. Surrealistic Pillow, which is the Jefferson Airplane's first album. A lot of those songs were there. The Doors, there were. Cream was a little bit later. It was the kind of period where people, I suppose, today maybe it's YouTube or Facebook, the kind of things that are feeding or trending. People would not quite live and die, but when a new album came out or an act was in town, that was the center of attention. It really was in many ways the hub of the wheel, that things revolved around. And I've since wondered, the old line about never trust anybody under 30. And these are all kids. The people who are doing all this music are under 30 themselves. So looking back, in some ways, it was the blind leading the blind, or maybe the unformed leading the unformed. But it really was, there was just an irresistible power there.
Considering you saw Cream in a garage,
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming they weren't as popular as they became at the
No,
time.
it was just around their first album, so they kind of exploded after that. I mean, Clapton had been in a bunch of groups, but Cream was kind of a new one.
Is it sort of a surreal feeling to know that you were that close to Eric Clapton before any of that blew up?
That's not surreal, just sort of. I mean, it's not like I knew him when I didn't know him. Yeah. I remember talking to Richie Havens backstage at the Club 47. Just sort of kind of chewing the fat. But there was, because if there's any feeling about that, it doesn't feel special. It was the times. It was kind of what we did, what was going on back then.
In that same article, you stated you marched with Father Grappi
Right.
on the Eagles Club in 1966.
Mm-hmm.
Could you describe what that experience was like?
It was in some ways circumstantial. 66 is kind of before the wheels were falling off American society, and it's just kind of the beginning, kind of the polarization, the generation gap, all those sorts of things. And I was dating a girl from Holy Angels, which is now part of DSHA. She lived up, it's a neurologist's daughter, lived up on Lake Drive. And I knew about the marches, but I was coming home to Hales Corners, which meant I had to cross the metro area, kind of from northeast to southwest. And I came across the line of march and decided, this is kind of interesting. And it's a really clear choice. I could either watch or I could march. And I said, well, let's march, kind of get out there. This is unacceptable that a club of powerful white men can say we don't want blacks in our membership and put it in writing. So that was, that got pretty powerful, got pretty ugly. We marched on Judge Cannon's house, another strong Marquette High family. And there probably may be legacies now, at Marquette High, grandkids or great-grandkids. But it was just the way things, the fluid situation. We ended up, there was this phalanx of National Guardsmen with their bayonets drawn and their helmets on. And it was I and a black kid, and it may have been just for the symbolism, of kind of black and white, holding a flag, between us and marching right behind the point of that phalanx. And I have really clear memories. On the sidewalks on both sides, there were hecklers, and guys saying, "Nigger lover, you want your sister to marry one?" I mean, just really spiteful, hateful. And when we got far enough, by that time it probably would have been the Wisconsin Avenue Viaduct at around 43rd or so. The protesters or the hecklers kind of disbanded, and we were kind of on our own. The National Guard let us alone, and there was real fear there, kind of about whether or not we'd be followed and attacked. And it had a bus waiting that took us back to the Freedom House on the north side. And I eventually, I don't even know how I got back to my car. So it was a powerful experience. It certainly was a very powerful experience. And it gave me a lot of respect for, Graffiti was just the physical courage, of being able to be out there and take all that abuse. Something pretty remarkable.
Did you feel any threat that you would be physically harmed that day?
Yes. Sure. Yeah. Well, I got back to Boston College that fall, and there was a pious kid who actually was in the freshman year. He was in the dorm room across from mine. His name was Dick. What was his last name? Doesn't matter. But we were in the cafeteria, and I said, "How you doing, Dick?" And he said, "Pretty good." I said, "Didn't see you all summer." He said, "I saw you." He'd been one of the toughs, who was on the sidewalk alongside, and he wasn't going to hit me, but it was pretty clear, that he was on that side and I was on this side. So it was, there was. You think about the abuse people took marching across the 16th Street Viaduct, rocks being thrown, bottles being thrown. Some of those photographs of the crowd on both sides there were just venomous, absolutely venomous.
Was there ever any contention between you and your parents concerning your protesting?
Oh Lord, I was not a nightly protester. It was far more generalized, and that was really common. My dad, kind of a military guy, reflexively Catholic. My mom converted from Lutheranism to his church. She said she liked the quiet, being at Mass back in those days before Vatican II. So there was this mutual, complete lack of understanding. Yeah, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And that was, if not universal, that was really pretty close. It never came to shouting matches, but there was what you'd, I guess, describe as a lack of unanimity, in my family, as in so many others.
Did you have any personal experience with the protests that happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.?
No, I was in BC then. I was in Boston, and that was a big deal in Milwaukee, but I wasn't part of that.
Okay, I think we're gonna take a break, a short break.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. And
Take two.
yeah. All right, we're gonna get back from where we left off. What compelled you to return to Milwaukee from Boston College?
I never had an inkling of a desire to stay in Boston. It was, part of it was culture. It's really interesting. Of the 8 guys from Marquette High who went to Boston College, 4 of us, maybe 2 stayed out there, 6 came home, and a couple dropped out, just because it was so kind of foreign in a lot of ways. And I stayed, probably more by inertia. than a real conscious decision to stay. But I never had any desire to stay in Boston. As it really is it's kind of a world city. There's the heart of Boston. It was really very compelling geography. And the last year I was there, and part of this may get into some of the pressures, but the last year I was there, the only way I could make myself go back was to get an apartment in the north end of Boston, which is where Old North Church is, and Paul Revere's house. It's got all that continental, colonial stuff, but it's the Italian neighborhood. It was this really, very, very strong Italian immigrant neighborhood. And even then, I guess that's sort of, in some ways, again, following my nose, kind of the instinct of being attracted to cultures, different cultures, and history, kind of them going back. And that was a fascinating neighborhood. I really, really enjoyed that neighborhood. But staying there, no.
Being a Milwaukee native, Milwaukee County native, did you ever feel homesick while in Boston?
Yes, but never disablingly so. It was, I guess, this kind of a hardening that goes on, or a growing up that goes on. You guys will feel when you're in college. So it was. I didn't pine for home, even though I wasn't having the best time. As a student there, it was not something that I said, I've got to go back to Milwaukee. I just knew I'd come home.
During the whole Vietnam era, how did you avoid getting drafted?
Early on, it was a student deferment, so we were all okay. After college, we sort of were waiting for the numbers for the draft. Mine ended up being fairly high, but I got out as 4F, for a condition that we don't need to go into here. So I was spared. That would not have been an experience I would have done anything close to well with.
Did you personally know anyone who was drafted?
Yeah, sure, a bunch of friends. One guy from Market High, Phil Eberhardt. I used to ride the bus with him, 64, and Market High every morning. He went to Vietnam as a medic, and the story is he was going out to assist wounded and was killed. So there were deaths, people I knew who died. At Boston College, one of my best friends wanted to avoid the infantry because that was kind of hamburger. So he enlisted in the Navy, ended up being put on the USS Nitro, which was a ship ferrying ammunition from California to Vietnam. So it was just sitting on a powder keg. So yeah, it was. No people who went to Canada, no people who went the CO route, and knew people who burned their draft cards, who protested, including some good friends, very good friends. Two of my best friends ended up being draft counselors, trying to help guys find their way out of service.
Did you actively oppose any Milwaukee politicians at the time?
No, the focus there wasn't so much local. The police chief was Harold Breyer, who was widely considered old school, repressive, rather brutal chief of police. But the focus was much more national. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were widely unpopular.
Were you involved in any of the UW Vietnam protests?
No, I wasn't. Good friends were. A couple guys from Market High. There was a bookstore and draft resistance center called Rhubarb. That was kind of a hotbed. There was Eastside Draft Counseling Center. There was another kind of a center. I should say, back in those days, especially sort of late college and then just after college, I was much more on kind of the inward side, and this is something that it's more circumstantial. But in the fall of '68, we went going to a Sun Ra concert. It was kind of an alternative musician, and we were smoking marijuana beforehand. It was laced with something, I'm not sure what, but I began to hallucinate, and it took me out. It just took me out for for weeks, I would get disoriented, just driving around Boston and coming home. I was getting lost, so it was really sort of panic time. And what basically happened was my sort of psychological bearings had become so much suspect that I kind of focused on school as kind of a way to, stay tethered, stay moored. And I got my best grades of 4 years, that last semester. And then came home that summer, worked construction for a while, but really spent a lot of time in the ozone. So it was, I was not psychologically, I guess, hardened enough or stable enough, to kind of be part of any kind of intentional movement. And that was not that unusual, especially kids who were doing acid. There were people doing LSD who would just fry themselves. And whatever I did, was, I think, fairly mild compared to that, but it was enough to really take me out of action. And so I have not. It was a sufficiently traumatic experience that if there was even smoke in the room after that, I would leave, and have not touched it since. So it seems to be a family thing, and our kids have tried it and have the same adverse or somewhat similar adverse reactions, and they won't touch it. So that I'm saying that only as a way of kind of explaining, that there was I was not a conscious militant, somebody who was on the lines. I was kind of, whoa, where am I? And it took a while to kind of come back to earth.
Before your experience that made you put down drugs, would you consider drug usage personally for you a staple at the time?
Yeah, but it was marijuana and beer. Whatever those last hits were, I'm not sure what was in there. But yes, it was the culture. It was something that you did, and it was. After that, I can recall being with friends who were tripping. They're on acid, and I'd go along, and I wouldn't begin. I think this feeling that the infrastructure there was threatened enough. I wasn't going to tear it apart. So, looking back, it was kind of fascinating just to watch these guys. Kind of really being kind of out there in some alternative reality. But I never went that far, and never would. But yeah, it was in the air. It was literally in the air.
What started or influenced your anti-war stance?
Again, it was in the air. It was something that was reflexive. There was I graduated from college in '69, and 1970 is when it all hit the fan. That's the year the campuses closed. That's the year when they were, the violence on campuses. And the difference between Vietnam and previous wars, when there might have been pacifists who opposed the violence, was that we were on the line for a war that seemed arbitrary, optional, and irrational. So, 50,000 people died. 50,000 Americans, my generation, died in Vietnam. And if you look back, that price was incalculably high for the result. We lost. In 1975, we left. So it was, in hindsight, it's easy to say it was, oh yeah, we shouldn't have done that. But at the time, though, when you're in it, it was just, the threat of going off to Southeast Asia and being cannon fodder, was just horrifying. And what magnified that was the fact that if you were white and middle class, we had lived a life of relative privilege. This was something that we had not been expected to think would happen. Our dads, were in World War II, but that's America's threatened. That's not the trying to intervene in the Civil War in Vietnam. So it was a very different kind of dynamic.
Did you feel targeted by the older generation? What was the dynamic of the counterculture versus the silent majority?
The dynamic was largely mutual ignorance. It was not being targeted or criticized, although that was there. It was on the part of the younger generation, dismissing our parents and their entire peer group as irrelevant. They had nothing to teach us. They had nothing to show us. That was wrong. That was really, why would you divorce that wisdom? Why would you cut yourself off from that wisdom? But back then, that was kind of the operative philosophy back in those years, and it was widely shared. One reason, again, this is just reconstructing, but one reason I got into history when I did was that the 60s were not just ahistorical, they were anti-historical. So anything from the past, that was brought up by the previous generation as of any importance, there was kind of an automatic dismissal of that. So, I've come to not just believe, but to know that there is a great deal of value in connecting with the past. So why would you cut yourself off, from these generations of human experience? But that's just what we were doing, it's just what we were doing. So it was kind of, again, the counterculture. We can change the world, we can make it happen, the Chicago songs. And it turned out to be kind of this sort of fairy tale castle that kind of collapsed of its own weight.
Do you remember having any arguments about Vietnam?
With my folks, especially, I had an uncle who was quite conservative, and we had a cousin especially who was really pretty outspoken, and they would just go at it, shouting matches. And it was a little like today, it was a little like, kind of the Trump and anti-Trump today, talking past each other, polarized, but there was there was no middle ground, and I think about that sometimes. We're in 2017, we're certainly a polarized society, and I don't think it's any worse than it was back in 1967, 68, 69, where there really was, kind of this Grand Canyon, in American society.
Do you remember hearing about the Milwaukee 14?
Sure, yeah, I knew them.
Can you express how you felt about them or any personal experience?
Admiration. I felt admiration. And there were two groups. One was the Milwaukee 14, who were draft resistors, and they took draft records and burned them from the old Brumder building down there in Plankinton and Wells. Then there was the Chicago 15, and I knew some of those guys pretty well, and they burned draft records in Chicago. So I was not, again, because I sort of on the sidelines, kind of doing the inward thing. Not someone who would have exposed myself to that kind of, to arrest and jail. So I felt a lot of admiration for those guys. A lot of them were priests, Milwaukee 14. And where I was hanging around, and a lot of it was, this is post-college, 69, 70, was around Casa Maria, the Catholic Worker House on 21st Street. And Mike Cullen, who was the founder of that Catholic Worker House, was one of the Milwaukee 14 and was deported back to Ireland for his troubles. I lived in a community house called Cherry Pit, 2214A West Cherry, a house that's since burned down. And that was largely people who were working somehow in the social services, draft counseling, mental health counseling. So there was kind of this nexus of people who were being part of the solution and not part of the problem, and kind of what came along with that was protest against the draft and against the Vietnam War. So actually for the Chicago 15, some of those guys, I still see them, but we would go down to Chicago for the trials, so showing support. So yeah, that was, they were heroes, within that segment of society. They were certainly heroes.
What was your personal connection with the members that you knew from the Milwaukee 14 or Chicago 15?
Largely social, through the Casa Maria, the Catholic Worker House, and mutual friends. I should explain that what brought me out of whatever funk I was in was when I graduated from college in June of '69, I came home with no idea what I was going to do. And I was sort of feeling unstable enough, so I didn't hitchhike that year. I just came home, got a construction job for a while. But then a friend, Frank Miller, actually another guy with my year at Marquette High, he'd been one of the draft resistors. He was living in a house called Cherry Pit, came to be known as Cherry Pit. And he was married, had a kid in the way, which was not entirely intentional. So he needed some way to keep body and soul together. So he and I and the next convict who was hanging around Casa Maria began a painting company called Tom Sawyer Painting Company. And we did that for 6 months during the spring into the fall. And it was kind of a fun time, but the weather turned cold. You're not getting word of mouth. The ladders aren't going to bring customers in anymore. And what happened that for me was really formative was Frank left Tom Sawyer and became the director of Journey House on the South Side again. I talked about the $45,000 budget. So he was the director of this really shoestring operation. And I was interested in photography. I took a couple courses at MATC. So I came down there as a volunteer and began to teach photography to kids in that neighborhood, and ended up becoming a staff member by January of '70 and stayed for 3 years. And that to me, the transition for me was kind of from this woolly, formless, amorphous, desire to be a poet or something like that, to being engaged in the world again. And that really turned, my psychology, my aspirations, my life around. And a lot of the lesson there was living for others. I know it's kind of a Marquette High mantra, but the fact that could work in a lower income, then largely Anglo, and becoming somewhat Latino neighborhood, that really pulled me out of kind of the psychological doldrums I was in. And it's an old lesson, but you get more than you give, when you work in kind of a service role. And to this day, I value and am grateful, for that experience. So it was something that was really set me on kind of the path to where I am today.
What kind of work were you doing during the Vietnam era after your construction job?
It was again the painting company. So little construction, and then 6 months with Tom Sawyer, and then Journey House from essentially fall of '69 as a volunteer, January of '70 as a staff member, and I stayed until fall of '72. So it was, by the time I left, I was assistant director and was doing everything from small group work with our kids to fundraising to ran an employment program, taught photography. We all kind of did everything, but that was kind of re-engaging with reality.
Aside from writing, you used artistic activities such as photography and painting for creative outlet?
No, I can't paint my way out of a box. We were painting houses, slapping it on. But yeah, photography, was and is, important to me.
How was the state of your faith life during the Vietnam? Did it factor into your stance at all?
During Vietnam, that was part of the larger counterculture, the larger sort of, not just counterculture, but the larger movements in American society. One reason I went to Boston College was because it was Catholic. Getting a full ride scholarship was certainly a compelling reason, but it was also the Catholic Harvard, is kind of what it was described as. And this is a time of real ferment in the church, and I was an active Catholic for the first year or so, but a somewhat brittle Catholic. It was kind of the observance and more doctrinaire than was probably a healthy point of view. And I stopped going to Mass, and by the time I got out of college, I would no longer consider myself a practicing Catholic. And am not today. I'm church going, So, I got married 40 years ago. Well, we go to a Lutheran church downtown called Village, kind of a rather sort of liberal congregation.
Did you support Governor Patrick Lucey? If so, what about his stance appealed to you?
I don't recall feeling especially strongly about Lucey. I recall liking what he was doing with education, kind of building a 4-year system of colleges for UW. That was formative, creative, smart governor, a smart guy. But he's not someone that I was especially tracked on, or didn't do doors for him, didn't make phone calls for him.
After you graduated college, did you fully drop the dream of ever becoming a politician even after?
Oh yeah, that got drummed out of me. I got sort of first being dropped on my head, and then having my head kind of turned in different circles. And I also came to know some people. I know a lot of people in public life, and came to realize that the demands of a politician's life are. I'm a relatively private person, and I can schmooze if I need to, but a steady diet of that would not be something that would be congenial. And recall talking to an alderman I know, he stepped down. I said, "Why'd you step down?" He said, "Jerk constituents." Kind of the demands that are placed on you by an irrational constituent base sometimes. I go to enough meetings, I'm on a bunch of boards, but the idea of elective office left me a long time ago.
Compared to many jobs, being a writer seems to have a certain type of freedom to it. Did you enjoy that?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, my dad was self-employed, and I have 2 brothers. They're self-employed as well. One is an architect and one is a voc rehab counselor. So yeah, that was certainly the appeal. And I think when it came to this interview, working on a book called Milwaukee, a City Built on Water, and I just spent the last week or so with 2 designers who were also good friends. And one of them said years ago, he said, "You and I were spoiled for real jobs. It's not going to happen. Doing something 9 to 5 is just not in the cards." So one of the things I love most about what I do is the variety of worlds I've gotten to visit and interpret and share. The price of that is it's 45 years of insecurity. I from one year to another, I had no idea, where the next job was, whether I could support 3 kids. So it's there's certainly, as in all aspects of life, there's a trade-off. So I made the choice. Having a patient wife is certainly very helpful. But I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't say, well, if I can't do this, I'll teach high school history or something like that. It was just kind of went ahead and did it. So I've been, I guess, when you think about it, kind of amazed, that it's been 45 years and I've been able to do this all this time. I've not had. I was joking. I did a column about turning 70, and I said if I wrote a memoir, it would be 45 years of 1099s. The subtitle would be "No W-2 since 1972," and that's true. It's been completely freelance.
That is the new 80.
Yeah, it's the gig economy. I've been doing the gig economy since 1972.
How did it feel to have so many people close to you participating in anti-war demonstrations?
It felt good, kind of, again, talking about the polarization in American society. You were kind of with me or against me, with us or against us. So it's the same kind of echo chamber mentality that exists today, where people on the left talk to people on the left, people on the right talk to people on the right. That was going on then. So it was having so many friends kind of in that movement, especially the people I knew were especially active. There were people who were kind of really on the front lines. But it was, again, reflexive, instinctive. It was pretty much taken for granted.
What was your most memorable experience or anti-war demonstration?
Anti-war demonstration? I'm not sure. I remember it was kind of on the sidelines, and civil rights was more powerful than Vietnam in Milwaukee. In a lot of ways, I recall that more as having more an emotional charge. Because I wasn't part. I didn't burn my draft card. I didn't need to. I was not part of the Milwaukee 14, the Chicago 15. So I can recall marches at the federal courthouse on East Wisconsin Avenue. But I don't recall nothing that as vivid, as marching with Father Grappi at about the Eagles Club protests.
Where and how did you meet your wife?
She's a graduate of St. Olaf College, and so we're 5 years apart. And she came down for her second semester junior year as part of an urban semester from St. Olaf in Minnesota. And there was a lot of kids I taught in that program later on after she was gone. But it was kids largely who were looking kind of for something else to do, kind of get off campus. And they all had internships. She worked at Next Door Center, 3 doors away or 3 blocks away from Marquette High. And that's where Our Savior's Lutheran Church is. Next Door Center used to be right next door to Our Savior's. So she worked there, and Frank Miller, the friend who was at Journey House, worked at Next Door and introduced us on her last night here, and we hit it off and began to date more seriously. And I think we kind of were together for about 3 years and got married in '77.
Do you remember if you participated in any demonstrations or activities relating to either civil rights or anti-war with your wife?
No, we marched for when the Iraq War, the Bush War. We took our kids, we had kids by then. We went down to the Federal Building, the new one on 3rd Street, and marched around there, kind of showing protest for the intervention in Iraq, Desert Storm, but no, otherwise not.
What are your personal beliefs on any possible connection between the Vietnam War and wars in the Middle East going on, and the Iraq War?
Beliefs?
Or position?
We're a very flawed species, and we tend to find it difficult to solve our problems by mediation or discussion. Violence is something that we go to as a default option far too quickly, and that's not just Vietnam and Iraq. That goes back to the Middle Ages, biblical times. Probably somewhere the midst of prehistory.
Why did you decide to settle in Bayview?
This was, I was working on a project for EWM, and it's called the Humanities Program, and one of the profs up there got a grant for 2 years, and one of the projects that was targeted was an encyclopedia of neighborhoods, and by that time I'd gone back to school. I'd gotten my master's in geography, so I was doing the kind of thing I was doing at Journey House. One kind of published piece led to another, and I realized I didn't know what I was doing. I was an English major, didn't know anything about the kind of social sciences. So I went back and got a master's in geography, and got hired by the Humanities Program as the writer for the neighborhood program. The first neighborhood I chose was Bayview, in the South Side. It's kind of living on the South Side, growing up in the South Side. Bayview was sort of the east side of the South Side. It was somewhat industrial and ethnic, kind of like the old South Side, but it was kind of this. It was also a little cooler, like the east side of the river, north of downtown. So it always had kind of an attraction for me, and just the physical uniqueness of it along the lake, and an old company town built around an iron mill. That was fascinating. I thought that was just a really interesting story. So I did a book called Bayview, Wisconsin, back in. Sonia? Okay. I did a book back in 1980 or 1979 called Bayview, Wisconsin, and Around the time that was in layout, there was a house on Knox Street. I knew I wanted to live here, and Sonia was interested too, near the lake. She was raised more in the rural areas or kind of ex-urban, Ottawa, Illinois, and then around Antioch, Illinois. So she was less kind of naturally drawn to a big city, but having the lake here, this huge expanse of open space is something that she found very attractive. Cudahy or Seminary Woods right next door by the seminary is another strong attraction. So it was kind of a no-brainer. We found a house on Knox Street, northern part of Bayview, for probably the last $36,000 house in Milwaukee, in Bayview at least, and bought that in what would have been 1980. We've been here ever since. It's a good neighborhood, and it's gotten cooler, since we moved in. It was our kids when they were in high school, all going to MPS. Said, "Why can't we live on the east side? That's kind of where the cool stuff is." And no, their friends live here.
How did it feel to start to become a local celebrity as you wrote more books on Milwaukee?
Yeah, it felt good. It's been, I guess one thing that really stands out is I'm the first to admit that this career has been largely circumstantial and accidental. I didn't sit there in 1970, and say I'm going to be a Milwaukee historian. Kind of one thing led to another. And I was working on one project after another, kind of one neighborhood or one company, commissioned histories. And then by probably 1995 or so, I realized I had enough pieces to kind of put together a whole puzzle. And that really, it was daunting. I spent 4 years writing a book called Making in Milwaukee. So it was a tall mountain to climb, but something that I found very gratifying. And it's also, in this town, maybe it's the ethnic kind of patterns here, but there's a real taste for history. There's a real kind of a feel for history that you would not find, in Spokane, Washington, or Sacramento, California. There's East Coast maybe, but there the layers are like Boston. It's more of the colonial stuff. It's not so much the European ethnic. So it's been, for me, I'm a product of Milwaukee. So the stuff is all very instinctual. But kind of a nice marriage of, kind of the skills I've was born with, the things I developed, and kind of the milieu here, kind of the market here. It's been lucky. It's still hard to get used to. I'm part of a TV show called Around the Corner with John McGivern. So I've done some public TV stuff, and probably we did a series called Making in Milwaukee. You guys watching that? Yes. The series, and it came out for the first time in '99. No, '06. '06 is when we finished that. And so my face was on TV, and getting used to being recognized is still something that feels weird. It feels strange. It's if you do this kind of thing, you want people to watch, and therefore, you'll have some name recognition, some face recognition, but it's still, it's not natural, but it's part of kind of what you have to do and what you do.
What do you think will be the lasting legacy of Milwaukee?
That assumes Milwaukee's going to die. I think cities they're eternal. Rome's still there, even though it's not Augustus Caesar. So there's kind of this long trajectory that cities have. So legacy in terms of, restate that, Anthony, how would you?
What do you think will be the lasting legacy of Milwaukee?
So the city of Milwaukee?
Yeah, the city, the county.
Okay.
Metropolitan area.
But legacy is something you leave to someone else.
Community?
I'd say legacy, or maybe cities exist largely for their own residents. You can be a tourist in another town, but what makes them tick, obviously, is the people who are part of the organism. That's kind of why they're here. And I think Milwaukee's earmarks, and maybe it's not legacy, but the historical patterns here are really well established, and among the things that really stand out are ethnic diversity. That's always been, I mean always been, a real strong point, a strong character point in Milwaukee. A tradition of making things. For many years we were one of the nation's leading manufacturing centers, and a lot of things went along with that, from kind of a worker-oriented political movement that became socialism in Milwaukee, to the word the Germans use is Gemütlichkeit, and it's sort of a meat and potatoes. That's kind of, I describe that as flowers in the front yard and tomatoes in the back. Kind of a good line. Baird Still, a really good Milwaukee historian, published a book back in 1948. He said that Milwaukee was essentially a worker-minded citizenry who wanted a substantial, agreeable, and well-ordered way of life. And each of those three is kind of its own characteristic. I think that still applies. I think in terms of long-term challenges, and they are the same for this country as they are for Milwaukee, but they're very obvious here, is what do you do in what has become more and more a post-industrial society to assimilate and give opportunity to an entrenched lower class? For generations until about 1980 or so, the early 1980s, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, you could finish high school, get an apprenticeship, and stay on one plant till you retired, and have 2 cars, and send your kids to college, and buy a house in the suburbs. You can't do that anymore. Those options are gone. And as a society, we have yet, to kind of figure out how you kind of lift people from that entrenched underclass into something that resembles, a more opportunity-rich society. And that's a clear challenge, for Milwaukee as for the nation.
Is there anything else you would like to bring up concerning your life in Milwaukee?
No, it's kind of, it's been, I guess if there's a summary comment, I was born here, I didn't choose it. This is something that I'm simply part of. But I feel, that I'm in some ways as much a part of Milwaukee as a fish is part of the sea. This is where I swim. This is kind of what I draw a breath from. But what's happened is that maybe it's just a reflection of my own kind of Milwaukee-born, Milwaukee-formed kind of predilections. But Milwaukee really does have kind of a nice, sort of a sweet spot between large and small. We're big enough. Have professional sports teams and 800,000 people coming to Summerfest, and urban problems, of a big city, and the diversity of a much larger city. But also, this is a real manageable town. It's real easy to get around in. I know a whole lot of people in public life. Just by the virtue of what I've done, the networks are fairly easy to penetrate. At least for middle class white guy, at least. So that kind of that middle point, where you have the diversity and the resources, the cultural buzz of a big city, and also kind of the manageability of the human scale of a smaller town. I love that about Milwaukee. I'll go down to Chicago once a year. I'll go bike around there, choose a neighborhood and bike around. We'll go down there at least once in winter, take the train down and poke around. So someone said Chicago is a great town to live 90 miles away from, and it really is. And it's sort of the contrast is really obvious, So there's an awful lot going on down there, but it's pretty hard to get around. Pretty overwhelming. So I feel for me, it's been a lucky and rewarding and sustaining and nurturing kind of a blend of the personal and the community.
Well, I think it's evident that you've played a significant role in preserving Milwaukee's history, and I think on behalf of Marquette University High School, we'd like to thank you for taking part and participating in our oral history project. So thank you, and I think we'll wrap it up.
Okay, you're very welcome, and it's been fun to be with you guys.
It's been fun.
You guys are wired.
Yeah, we're in school mode still.
Yeah.